Steve Smith achieved 947 rating points after the MCG test in the 2017-18 Ashes. That's according to the ICC batting rankings. The only ranking we've ever had higher than that is Bradman's 961. And when talking about Donald, it's worth remembering that the only batter he ever looked at and thought he bats a little bit like me was Sachin Tendulkar. So generally, when you hear best since Bradman, it's probably going to be Sachin or Smith. But there are other things in common as well, like problem solving. Not only are they two of the most talented batters that we have ever had, but they're also extremely adaptable and deep thinkers of the game who can just change things up on a whim. They're very different kinds of players than Ricky Ponting or Virat Kohli, who are extremely driven individuals and incredible athletes. Those two are also great test batters, but they don't have the technical mastery or the ability to just fidget with things during an innings to change it up. And of course, these two guys also have something else in common. But the question that we had, and we've been thinking about for a while, is who is the better player in tests, Smith or Sachin?
As a cricket journalist, I would travel sometimes up to 200 days a year. I loved watching cricket games. I loved going to new countries. It was an absolute dream. But there was one thing I hated more than anything else about it, and it was this little pin. The thing that I need to change my SIM card in every new country. The absolute worst thing about this pin and SIM cards is when I was traveling to the West Indies, of having to arrive in every new island or country and having to work out if I could still find this pin and then line up and get my SIM card in every single airport. Well, now we have the answer thanks to Sally. They can make it so you never have to worry about this nonsense ever again. They use an eSIM app that once you install once, it is easy, simple, and cheap. Oh, and it works in more than 160 countries. And you can throw these pins away forever, because now you just need to download the Sally app before your trip. And if you do it with our code, Good Areas, you get an exclusive 15% discount on Sally eSIM data plans. So before your next holiday or work trip or anytime you have to travel to another country, download the Sally app and use the code Good Areas, or one word, at checkout, and you can travel like a pro with Sally.
If you have a short-term memory, it's important that you realize that the last couple of years of Steve Smith have not been his normal routine. But even with that, Smith has a match factor that means he averages 58% more than the rest of the top six batters from both teams in the games that he has played. That is a bonkers record for someone who actually went through a little bit of a slump. Tendulkar's record in his career is only 30% better. But it is important to remember who he batted with. He had Rahul Dravid, Vrinder Sehwag, Mohammad Azharuddin, and VVS Laxman for a long period during his career. Now, Smith has obviously had David Warner, Marnus Labuschagne, and Usman Khawaja, which is still strong, but it's not quite on the level that Sachin's was. And those greats around Sachin also affect his contribution to the total runs. Smith has scored nearly 16% of the runs in the matches that he's played, while Tendulkar is at 14.82%. But you can see the effect of playing with other great batters is more prominent in Tendulkar's record. Of course, the other issue for match factor is that the team's bowling attacks affect it, since the opposition's top six batters are also considered. And it would be reasonable to say that Smith has played with the better bowling attacks on his team than Tendulkar ever did. It's also worth noting that Tendulkar maintained these numbers over a significantly larger sample size. He also played several matches as a teenager and then again after turning 35. And you'd be shocked to know that he's one of the best teenagers of all time and also one of the best old man batters of all time. Smith didn't have to play a test match before turning 21. And the current test match he's playing at the moment is only his sixth beyond the age of 35. And because Tendulkar's career is so long, it's probably fair to actually split it into different parts. Until 1991, he really wasn't all that consistent. However, he was 60% better than other batters in the same games he played in for the next 11 years. This was his best period in Test cricket. From 2003 to 2010, he had a very solid period, but he was only 23% better. But of course, the dip in match factor can be explained by a few things. Tendulkar had a tennis elbow injury in 2004, which kept him out for almost half a year. And many batters struggled to recover from that as well. He also started playing on flatter pitches and in greater batting lineups. So he wasn't standing out as much since everyone around him was also doing really well. And the dip is also something we notice in his ODI career. In the last 3 years, there was a clear decline. His test average actually dips from almost 57 after his 177th test, that was where he smashed South Africa in Newlands, to 53.8 when he played his last match at Wanketi. Also remember, this is a period where a lot of people were making runs. Smith's arc is obviously completely different. He broke into the team as a lower order batter, largely because he could bowl leg spin. Although it's worth remembering that no one actually thought he was a full-time leggy. So up until 2012, he was actually an under par test cricketer. He followed that up with a 7-year stretch that few batters have ever had before. 80% better than the other batters in his game. In the 2020s, his match factor has dropped to 28% better, which is still incredible, but for him, quite a drop. I think his slump overall looks worse because his average has dropped a lot, but in a period when no one was making runs, so he was still pretty great. And of course, he's also being compared to the old Smith, who was probably the best since Bradman for those 7 years. But if your slump is still 28% better than everyone else, you're doing pretty well. There is also an element of the pitches being more result-orientated in the matches that Smith played. The World Test Championship, combined with the wobble ball taking over and a few spicier wickets around, means that there's a lot more results now than there certainly was in Tendulkar's era. In fact, over 31% of the matches that Tendulkar played in were draws. For Smith, that is less than 14%. And it is worth saying that the average per wicket in results matches is about 27.5, while in draws, it is 37. Smith has certainly missed out on a lot of the powder puff wickets where no bowler could get anything happening. But when you actually look at Tendulkar's match factor, he has a similar record in both result matches and in draws. On the other hand, Smith gets a little boost from draws, even though he hasn't played anywhere near as many as Tendulkar did. Now, Don Bradman's career lasted 80 innings. And using that as a reference, we look at the batters who have the best match factor over that period of time. Smith is the only batter other than Don Bradman who averaged more than twice the rest of the top order players in his peak. If this is your favorite metric, Smith is truly the best player since Bradman. Tendulkar had an outstanding peak himself. He was 74% better than the batters in his game. So it still gets him in the top 15 list of all time. What's interesting is that Tendulkar played 30 innings before his best 80-inning streak, and he would go on to play another 219 knocks after that. Smith played in 42 innings before his peak, and he's played in 82 since. And they have a similar match factor in after peak as well. But Smith does a lot better before that peak. But when you think about Sachin, he was 25% better than other batters for over 200 innings after he'd already had his peak, which is a ridiculous record. One extra thing we should point out with Smith, of course, is that after his peak, he also decided to be an opener for his own weird reasons. And that probably didn't help him in an era where no one should be an opener. We looked at low-scoring games and high-scoring games as well. So when the rest of the top 6 batters average below 35, Tendulkar is 75% better than the others. He really rises compared to Smith. However, in the high-scoring games, Tendulkar doesn't really stand out at all. He's only 16% better, while Smith is almost exactly the same, whether it's a high-scoring game or low-scoring. But over half of Smith's innings were low-scoring due to the wobble ball. For Sachin, it was about 35%. This means that Sachin was actually better than Smith on bad wickets, but Smith has played on them a lot more, and he doesn't seem to mind if it's a good or a bad pitch. Since they both spent their careers at number 4, comparing their entry points is pretty important. In Test cricket, it's not just about how many runs you make, it's about when you make them. We roughly lose a wicket every 10 overs in Test cricket, so we've looked at before 20 overs and after 20 overs. So when these two come in before that 20-over mark, they both average around 50, with Smith just a little bit higher. And weirdly enough, when they come in after, they both average more, but again, roughly the same. When it comes to pace bowling, Smith has one of the most outstanding records. At his peak from 2014 to 2019, he averaged nearly 100 against fast bowling. In Asia, his record is above 75, while it's 54 in the rest of the world. And he's still averaging 50 plus after the pace-paying pandemic. Tendulkar also has a terrific record where he averages more in Asia, but he still goes at nearly 50 outside of that in a career that spanned 24 years. These are clearly two of the greatest players of pace ever. Their graphs have a similar pattern against spin, but the Indian has a better record, which of course you would expect, both in Asia and outside. However, Smith's record is really good in Asia. In fact, both of these players are close to being great in the skill that they shouldn't be as good at. The reason these two are so good is their ability to conquer pretty much everything. And that includes the best bowlers of their generation. We looked at the combined head-to-head records versus the 10 greatest of their respective eras. They both average mid-40s against these great bowlers. Smith is just slightly higher. You could argue that Tendulkar faced greater bowlers like Shane Warne, Glenn McGrath, and Dale Steyn. But Smith did it in a more bowling-friendly against R. Ashwin, Jasprit Bumrah, and Kagisa Rabada. Like, both of them had to overcome a lot. And all things considered, these are both incredible records. And of course, one of the reasons why these two are so good is they do it everywhere. Both have an average of 40 in every country where they've played at least 5 innings. Smith has a match factor of greater than 1.5 in Australia, England, India, Sri Lanka, West Indies, and close to that in New Zealand as well. It is only less than par in Pakistan and the UAE. He's actually still made a lot of runs there. It's just that everyone else made more. Tendulkar's match factor in Bangladesh was 3.87, which feels like cruel and unusual punishment for what was a new test nation. It is above 1.25 in South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, India, Sri Lanka, and Zimbabwe. And like Smith, his match factor is also slightly below par in Pakistan. But despite that, he still played some very memorable knocks over there, including his unbeaten 194 in Multan. If you exclude India and Australia for both players, Smith has a higher match factor than Tendulkar in England, New Zealand, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the West Indies. If you just look at percentage of runs by country, again, Tendulkar has a high percentage in only South Africa and Bangladesh. And of course, Smith's record then looks a lot more impressive. But you do have to remember things like longevity, batting support, and bowling attacks here. Tendulkar was consistently great over an endless career. We looked at match factor over a 10-test rolling period as well, and Tendulkar's peak of 2.2 was at the 118 match mark. For Smith, it was at 2.52 after 67 games. Remarkably, it never dropped below par for Smith. But Tendulkar has a couple of moments like that. But the other thing that Tendulkar had was more frequent peaks, even if they weren't as high as Smith's. We also like to look at plus years. Tendulkar had 17 of them, while Smith is currently at 10. When it comes to great years, like a match factor above 1.25, they were at 13 and 8 respectively. But Smith's highs were higher, and he was 100% better than batters in 4 different years. Tendulkar had that for 3. So that is a lot of information. And that's the kind of levels that we like to look at for these kinds of players. And we've clumped these two together because at different stages of their careers, they really look like they were going to push towards a Bradman-like level career. Maybe not in terms of average, but certainly the modern day equivalent. And when it comes to Steve Smith, he had a peak that was only secondary to the Don, and he completely dominated the world. I think you can make a very reasonable conclusion that Smith during his peak was definitely better than Sachin. But whose career would you take? Would you prefer the batter who had 10 plus years and was great for 8 of them, or the one with 17 plus years and was great for 13 of them? And I think that's the most interesting thing here. India didn't need to worry about another batter for 24 years. And while I still think Steve Smith's ceiling was a little bit higher, how do you compare 13 great years to 8? It's a long way short. So even if he was greater in that shorter period, I'm not sure it was ever enough to overcome what Sachin actually did. And the thing for me, having looked at all this information, is I think you can make a claim for Sachin to be the greatest test batter of all time. He might still lose that conversation to Don Bradman, but I think you can definitely have the conversation to begin with. I don't think you can with Steve Smith, at least yet. And the truth is that we're not sure how long he will continue to bat. He could actually finish with a better record than he has at the moment. What if he batted on for another 5 years at his current level? I mean, he's been making hundreds very easily over the last couple of months. And of course, this could go completely the other way. His consistency could take a hit, especially if he decides to open again. And the one thing that we know about Steve Smith is the batter that he is now will slightly change. Because after he made the 100 at the Gabba, he said that he's been changing his technique for 15 years. Pretty much every time he goes out to bat. And if you combine that with the fact that you can't really bowl the channel just outside off stump to him, or even at the stumps because he's just moved across, he really is a super villain. But Tendulkar had a lot of that as well. He prepared for Shane Warne by telling leg spinners to bowl around the wicket into a rough that he had dug up just for that purpose. He redesigned his arm guard after a chat with a waiter in Chennai. He decided on the field that he would not play a single cover drive in his famous innings at the SCG. The truth is that Sachin Tendulkar made his entire life revolve around scoring runs. And Steve Smith shadowbats every minute he is not out in the middle actually doing his job. Who you think is greater will be down to your personal choice. But for us, what we really came to think about is how similar these two guys were. I mean, they might both be the best since Bradman. It took God and the demon to build international cricket, but don't tell Johnny Bairstow. 1882, Australia had played one test in England against the god W.G. Grace, and they sucked. So they were playing him again, and it was a tough wicket. But England was in front, so Australia was desperate for a third innings lead. At number 8 was young all-rounder Sammy Jones. After a routine single, he walks down to do some gardening on the pitch. Grace whips off the bails and appeals. The ball wasn't dead, Jones was run out. The Australians were furious. In fact, some of the English players were also furious. But what Grace said went, and the umpires had already given it. Next in was Fred Spofforth. He was known as the demon fast bowler. He was furious, and he let England know exactly what was coming next, which was maiden. There's 12 maidens. I can't count them all. England only needed 85 to win. W.G. Grace made 32. England only 77. That was the test where the Ashes began. Buy my book, Overthrowing Cricket's Empire, on Amazon today.